Can you talk about what's happened there?
Yeah, I mean, right now there's not just one Al-Shabaab. I think there's been a real fracture within the organization. And a few weeks ago, the most high-profile American jihadist that was operating with Al-Shabaab, Omar Hamami, who was from Alabama, and was sort of like a rapper and propagandist for Al-Shabaab, was killed. And it appears that he was killed by a rival faction of the group. And I think part of what we're seeing is that the section of Shabab that is more aligned with the global vision of what was Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda network and Ayman al-Zawahiri's mission is trying to make a mark for itself. And I think that it's a group that's very much in trouble internally in Somalia, and I think is trying to project that it has a more globalist jihadist agenda. And so this attack on the Westgate Mall, I think was indicative of the fact that there are multiple versions of Al-Shabaab. One part of Al-Shabaab is primarily focused on Somali politics and taking power within Somalia, and the other is intent on sort of making a name for itself as a global terrorist player. And I think that's part of what we saw here at Westgate Mall. And
the issue of Americans involved in Al-Shabaab?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been anywhere from, a couple dozen to, 50 or 60 Americans that have gone to Somalia to work alongside or fight alongside Al-Shabaab or other militant organizations. Many of them have come from the state of Minnesota, and the Somali American community. I was there recently. Is really caught in a difficult position because on the one hand they're being targeted by federal agents and they're being targeted by surveillance, and they have their mosques and their community organizations being surveilled. On the other hand, people in that community are very concerned about the fact that young people are being recruited from Minneapolis to go to Somalia. There have been several young Somali Americans who have acted as suicide bombers, trying to blow themselves up blowing themselves up at the gates of the U.S.-backed African Union forces that are in Somalia, or attacking Somali government ministries. And on the one hand, this is a real problem that you have these young people that are being recruited and going over there. On the other hand, there's been this incredible overreaction to it, and I think a lot, immigrant communities are being targeted for this. And in the whole scheme of things, it's a relatively small problem. But I think that there's, Representative Peter King has just been, who's, the informal chair of the Islamophobe caucus in Congress, has really sort of tried to paint this as like, some kind of boogeyman on steroids. But I mean, it's a real issue. But I think that the fact that the Somali community in Minneapolis is under this kind of intense scrutiny right now is unjust on the one hand. On the other hand, they've really been unified in speaking out and demonstrating against what happened at the Westgate Mall.
And what do you think, Jeremy, contributed to the expansion of Al-Shabaab and to the splintering of which you spoke?
Right. I mean, all of a sudden now we have like like seahorses where you pour the thing in and it creates seahorses. We have that with like the terrorism expert industry now. Everybody knows everything about Al-Shabaab, and yet there's very little context given to this. I mean, one of the things that I get into in my book, in Dirty Wars, is where Al-Shabaab came from. In the early 2000s, the Bush administration made a disastrous decision to put all of these warlords on the CIA payroll. And they came up with this name called the Alliance for the Restoration of Peace and Counterterrorism. And I tracked down some of these warlords when I was in Somalia and in Kenya. And they basically had them acting as an assassination squad. Most Somalia experts said that there were no more than a dozen al-Qaeda connected individuals in Somalia right after 9/11. And so the CIA hires these warlords ostensibly to go and hunt these people down. Well, they end up murdering vast numbers of people who were imams or religious scholars, and in some cases, I was told that they would literally like chop people's heads off and then bring them to their American liaisons and say, "This is so and so, and I've killed him." And so you had this utterly thuggish collection of warlords murdering people, and doing so, they believed, with the backing of the United States of America, the most powerful nation in the world. That sparked then a revolt against the warlords. And so what happened was that these coalitions of religious figures from different regions of Somalia formed something called the Islamic Courts Union. And basically it was 12 Sharia courts, meaning that there were 12 regional authorities who had imposed some version of law in the areas that they controlled. They came together and united as one body, and they started to pool their resources in an effort to overthrow the CIA's warlords from Mogadishu. There was a 13th unofficial member of the Islamic Courts Union, and that was Harakat Shabab al-Mujahideen, which is Al-Shabaab. And so Al-Shabaab was the only faction within the Islamic Courts Union that had any presence of foreign fighters, and they were the least powerful. They had the least credibility in Somalia, the least visibility. And so when the Islamic Courts Union took Mogadishu, they expelled the CIA warlords. They imposed a brutal but effective form of governance on Mogadishu, effective in the sense that it stabilized the city. Crime rates plummeted. They reopened the ports. There were also all sorts of vicious, violent punishments meted out against people who violated what they perceived to be the tenets of Islamic Sharia law. But it was, almost everyone except probably Bush-era officials would agree that it was the only moment from the time Siad Barre's regime fell in the early 1990s until 2006 that there was anything vaguely resembling stability in Mogadishu. The CIA's warlords are kicked out. The Islamic Courts Union is in control. The U.S. then covertly partners with the Ethiopian dictatorship, and Ethiopia launches an overt invasion of Somalia to overthrow the Islamic Courts Union. The fact that they were called Islamic, probably, Bush is like batting, a ball of yarn in the back while Dick Cheney's running the country, and they hear Islamic, and it's like, oh, we got to overthrow them. So that's basically what happened. It was this knee-jerk reaction. If you actually look at the people that made up the Islamic Courts Union, there was a mishmash of people. Yes, there were people that were extremists, but most of them were not. Most of them were people that more closely resembled the Taliban government, not the Taliban movement, but the Taliban government. It's, by all standards, a brutal form of government, but these were not people that wanted to attack the United States at all. There was no U.S. interest in doing this except for knee-jerk sort of neocon reactionary politics. So they overthrow that government. And then JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, and the CIA use the cover of this overt invasion to go in and start hunting people. And they want to take out all of the leaders of the Islamic Courts Union. They're looking for people that were involved with the 98 bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and they start this assassination campaign. And they use drones, and they're using AC-130 gunships, and basically the Islamic Courts Union is totally dismantled. Somalia then reverts to this state of brutality and civil war. And you then have the Ethiopians committing rape, murdering civilians, torturing people, setting up their own prisons, rendering people back to Ethiopia. It becomes an utter disaster. And what ends up happening is that Shabab, this group of relative nobodies for so many years who were sort of on the periphery of this movement, start to say, well, we will be the vanguard in the fight against the U.S.-backed Ethiopian invasion, and we will take up arms and we will defend Somalia. And they started mixing together the ideas and rhetoric of Osama bin Laden with a sort of Somali nationalist politics, and end up getting a tremendous amount of support because they were the only people fighting. And so what happened there, this is incredible, is that Osama bin Laden tried to take credit for the Black Hawk Down incident, in the early 1990s, and it was a complete lie. They had nothing, to do with it. Maybe there were some people that could reasonably be called jihadists that were involved with that, but it was not Osama bin Laden's plot, and yet Osama bin Laden had tried to take responsibility for it.
18 U.S. soldiers were killed, but also thousands of Somalis.
Oh yeah, thousands and thousands of Somalis were killed. It's basically one of the only things most people know about Somalia was Black Hawk Down, and most people don't even know. It's like when we talk about the Vietnam War, people know, that there were 65,000 U.S. troops killed. Did people know that multi-million Vietnamese were killed? It's the same with the Black Hawk Down incident. Thousands of Somalis were butchered, in the aftermath of that.
When the U.S. Helicopters came in.
Yeah, the U.S. helicopters came in. They were hunting.
This was under George H.W. Bush.
Right, and it was President Clinton ended up pulling the Army Rangers and the whole U.S. presence out of Somalia, but they were hunting Mohammed Farah Aidid, this warlord, who had basically destroyed Mogadishu and created the situation where you had this civil war in Somalia. But the point I'm getting at here is that Al-Shabaab was largely a non-player in Somalia, and Al-Qaeda had almost no presence there. And the U.S., by backing these warlords and then overthrowing the Islamic Courts Union, made the very force that they claimed to be trying to fight the most powerful force in Somalia.
But what is at stake for the U.S. in East Africa and the Horn of Africa? What are their interests there?
Well, I mean, I think initially it started with with a sort of knee-jerk reaction to 9/11, and I mean, the fact was that there were major terrorist events that happened as a result of Somalia's lawless situation. There were people being harbored in Somalia that were involved with the '98 embassy bombings, and I think that Rumsfeld and Cheney early on after 9/11 developed this program called Next Steps, and they were citing all these countries that they intended to go into, and Somalia was on the early list of countries. And you had the State Department, Colin Powell and others cautioning against it and saying we shouldn't go in here, but there were people in the Pentagon who wanted to run the deck all over the world and wanted to send people in there. And so I mean, I think part of it, there are natural resources in Somalia. It has the largest coastline of any nation in Africa. There's a very potentially lucrative fishing industry that exists there. It's part of why you see the rise of piracy, is that European and other shipping companies are coming in. They're dumping in the Somali waters, but also illegal fishing is happening all the time. When people eat lobster and they're told it's Kenyan lobster, it almost certainly is actually from the Somali coastline or from the Somali waters. So, I mean, I don't think that there's some nefarious conspiracy behind the scenes, but Somalia, if Somalia was a stabilized country, there's tremendous natural resources and wealth in Somalia. But I think it has more to do with this narrow U.S. view of terrorism being this epic global threat and reacting in that way constantly or consistently.